So this evening, the first bit of reports from the administration is our Kutztown Area School District Comprehensive Plan for the years of 2022 through 2025. The comprehensive planning process began way back in the fall of 2019 as we had a group together sitting right here on this floor prior to COVID-19 discussing strengths, weaknesses of the district. Really started with a review of the mission, vision, and values. And as processed 19, there were some delays, obviously, through this and the requirement to submit the comprehensive plan. But we continued along with that process as best we could and really ramped up in the spring of last year. So in that comprehensive planning, the first piece, as I discussed, is the review of the mission, vision, and values. Oh, there's the clicker. Working all different here, we have the clicker not working. In that review back in January of 2020, we sat with a group of parents, students, teachers, community members to review sort of the mission and vision of the Kutztown School District. Emerged was that most in the community that we met with really found great value in the mission, but through those conversations, through processes of what we want for a school district for our students, there was an addition of the word empowered there, knowing that our grow as empowered contributors to a global community, empowering them to engage within the community from whatever their interests might be as they grow into adults that contribute to what this global community turns into. The vision, maximize potential, embrace change, and create the future has remained the vision that was embraced by those who met with us in that initial planning phases. In addition to our mission and values, there are the belief statements that go along with those values. All students can learn. Lifelong learning is essential, that individuals must possess a sense of purpose and belief in their own potential for collaboration among the home, school district, and community positively impacts learning. Critical thinking and the acquisition and application of knowledge are keys to success. Diversity is valued, individuality is celebrated. Individuals are responsible for their choices and accountable for those actions. Healthy choices are imperative for a safe and interactive environment is critical, and decision-making is expected. You know, those are belief statements that had ascribed to in the previous comprehensive planning process. And as we again vetted them with the community members involved back in 2019, 2020, still believing that those are belief statements that align with the values.
So the process is laid out by PDE, and it's a fairly scripted process. We don't have a lot of latitude in what we look at. We're even told which data to look at. I suppose that's so PDE gets a common look across the Commonwealth. So one of the first things I had to do once we completed our mission, vision, and values work, we then took our administrative and our leadership team, and we did a needs assessment. And there was two things that we were really doing there: reviewing student performance, and then PDE calls equity considerations. I'll explain those in a moment. So in the needs assessment, there's three areas that are mandatory to look: English language arts, math, and science, technology, and engineering. These are also areas the state has a state assessment in. And so what we're doing is we're reviewing and analyzing and discussing a variety of relevant data sources, mostly identified by the state, but we are also allowed to look at some of our own data sources. So you'll see throughout the STAR testing, which is not something the state would condone, but we use for benchmark testing. In a lot of ways, it's more useful than what the state gives us, because the state will test us once a year. STAR testing we can do multiple times, and we can use it for growth, identifying growth in our students. So there's this category called equity consideration, and they ask you to look at subgroups identified. We really only have 3 subgroups. We only have enough students to have 3 subgroups. So it could be a minority group. If you have a great enough number of minority students, that can be a subgroup. But the subgroups that we have are English language learners, special education, students with disabilities, and students considered economically disadvantaged. And in looking at the data from these 3 subgroups, I have 3 things for each one. And there's been a lot of discussion over the last 6 months about kind of where might our gaps be, where are the areas where our students might be underperforming. The discussion on that, those 3 areas are, and it's borne out in data. So I do want to take time to read these. In the past 3 years, we've experienced a significant decline in the percentage of English learners proficient and advanced measured by PSSA assessments. Now, our numbers continue to rise. As of this last year, we had 33 students that were English language learner. As of today, we have 42. So a marked increase again. As little as, I don't know, 3, that number was, I don't know, Dr. Quinn, probably below 20, correct? Yeah, below 20. So we continue to see an increase in our English language, and we've seen that in the needs for an ELL teacher that we've in the last we've seen a growth there. Secondly, a disproportionate number of learners are chronically absent in each year over the past 2 years. Attendance is one of the things they ask you to look at. You have to look at attendance and attendance groups, and are there any differences between groups? And so it's sort of a stark, it's an interesting statistic, and we don't really have an explanation for it. But it is something we'll be looking at in the coming years. Why is that? Thirdly, there's a greater percentage of English learners not reaching proficiency in STAR, which is the local assessment that we use that is benchmarked against a lot more students than just our district. In grades 3 to 5, and it's in both ELA and math. Now, this is in comparison to the all student groups. So throughout the plan, you'll see this all students. That's all of the Kutztown students combined. And then you compare the subgroups to the all student group. And that's where you're looking for, is there a discrepancy between achievement in those groups? So these are the 3 things that we saw with learners. With disabilities, the state average for students that have been identified with disabilities is between 17 and 18%. We started this process in 2019. The state average has gone up, but ours has too. Students with disabilities in Kutztown make up 21% of our student population. Last year, when we had a cyclical monitoring, which is the state comes in and looks at our processes for special education, this was one of the things we were dinged for, because numbers are too high. And so later I'll get to an explanation of why we think our numbers are so high and what our to trust that. 40 to 50% of all absent students came from our students with this population. So the students with disability population, which is 21% of our students, accounted for, and it's 40 to 50 because the data is really messy for the last 2 years. What do we call an absence? What do we not call an absence? You know, why is here, why are they not? So that's why you see the range of 40 to 50. It's in there depending on how you read the data. Students with disabilities achievement on Keystone exams falls significantly below the all student group in literature, algebra, and biology, all of the Keystone assessments. So our students with disabilities are not performing at a level that we are satisfied with. There's a disproportionate numbers of students with disabilities that are not reaching proficiency in grades 3 to 8 on PSSAs in ELA, math, and science. So in grades 3 to 8, again, look at the numbers against the all student group, we're just not achieving at the same level, or at least a level acceptable to us. It's too big of a disproportionate gap in the two. Students considered economically disadvantaged. This has been a really hard group to define in the last 20 months. This is usually driven by students who apply for free and reduced lunch, and the federal government has made lunches and all meals in schools free for the last 2 years. And so our understanding of who's economically disadvantaged is probably a little bit handicapped today. But that we were looking at was when we knew who the economically disadvantaged students were. So we're a little cloudy on who they would be today, but we're not cloudy on the data that we were looking at previously. There's a disproportionate number considered economically disadvantaged that are not reaching proficiency in grades 3 to 8 on PSSA assessments and ELA and math. There's also a disproportionate number of students considered economically disadvantaged that are proficiency on Keystone in literature, math, and science. The math would be algebra. And there's a disproportionate number of students considered economically disadvantaged that are not reaching the 40th percent in grades K to 8 as measured by STAR. The 40th percentile, so when you look at STAR, you have to, you're generally trying to measure growth. And we established the 40th percentile, and STAR establishes the 40th percentile. So students 40th percentile, meaning 40% of all the students who take STAR fall below that, and 60% are above that. That's the threshold that STAR says you can start to look for proficiency on PSSA. So that's a benchmark that we use, the 40th percentile, because STAR says if they're at the 40th percentile, they may very well be proficient. So that's kind of a marker of how we know. If they're above the 40th percentile, they really probably ought to be proficient. If they're below it, they're going to struggle on the PSSA. So in summary of those things for in the category of equity in the portion of the study of equity considerations, let me summarize really in this statement. Achievement in English language, English learner students, students with disabilities, students considered economically disadvantaged, as measured by PSSA, Keystones, and STAR in ELA, math, and science have fallen behind the all-student group. Now, I don't think that town would be alone in finding these statistics. I think these statistics are probably can be found in other districts. What the comprehensive plan asks us to do is to look hard at our data and say which students do we have that are falling behind, and what is going to be our action plan to address those. So that was the result of our needs assessment. So at that point, we switched to a self-assessment. We rate ourselves, and Mr. Chatton will pick up there.
Can I ask a quick question before you move on?
Yep.
Okay, so obviously we're in a kind of strange couple of years back to back. I'm wondering, you said in a lot of points that the data is cloudy just because of circumstances out of our control. We've been measuring socioeconomic by free lunches. Are we going to be changing how we try to collect that information to adapt to the way things are now, or is it going? Okay.
I mean, in theory, it would go back, assuming that the free lunch status, for all isn't something that exists beyond this school year. But that's how the state collects that. So, and people could still complete the forms, but there's really no incentive to do so if the lunch is free, no matter who you are. So that's where that data is incomplete in a given year like this or last because of it. So we are the assumption that that's not going to be status quo going forward, and that we would be able to collect that information once again. And attendance, where we encourage people to stay home when they're ill. You have your testing, stay home, quarantining and isolating, is a little bit different, but there's so many different variables into attendance this year. So in that assessment of conditions for leadership, teaching and learning, there's categories: not yet evident, emerging, upper, exemplary. Those ratings used to identify strengths and challenges. Some of the categories are empowering leadership for continuous improvement, focusing, improvement on instruction, centered supports, data-driven human capital strategies, and the allocation of resources strategically. Those exemplary ratings include local business community partnerships and the recruitment and retaining of fully credentialed qualified staff. Emerging ratings maintain focus on system continuous improvement and organizational coherence for those systems, school supports in implementing evidence-based strategies. All students have access to rigorous standard instruction, and that's a very, very high standard as, you know, as we talk about these going forward to the priorities that we set. Some strengths include aspiring to implement evidence-based instructional strategies and programs, the recruiting of fully credentialed staff to support development and professional learning of central office staff in alignment with the mission, vision, and goals, and partnering with community organizations. Those are strengths. Challenges: implementing and sustaining tiered intervention systems to support student growth across all grade levels. That's what you'll see we'll talk about in the planning phase mostly. You know, in those multi-tiered intervention levels, we have much stronger systems in the elementary. As they get to secondary, they end up becoming less, they're not as strong and consistent. And there's reasons for that. When you look at remediation on a secondary level, it's typically about grades, GPA, credits, et cetera. It's those measures. But, you know, the best multi-tiered intervention system skill sets. If you don't have the basic literacy skills, how are you going to perform in some of your classes? If you don't have the basic math skills necessary for whether it's your math or science classes, how are you going to perform in those classes? So it's maintaining those multi-tiered level of interventions for grades and credits, et cetera, because that is important as well, because that takes away from what happens in the secondary levels in terms of skill sets that impact those systems as well. A vision of and culture of options for all students, you know, that really comes down to some of those data points. When we see that there's a difference between attendance and achievement and graduation, depending on different categories, we need to make sure that we are fostering a vision of culture and high expectations for all. So again, comes out to these notable observations. Students considered disadvantaged, ELL, or students with disabilities fall student academic achievement, graduation rate, and attendance. Again, that's a real highlight, and that students with disability, the population is larger. It's something that has been, you know, a focus of the district for quite a few years in trying to reduce the number. And we say reduce the number because it speaks to data, but reducing the percentage of students identified isn't about a number. It's about providing access to more students to the least restrictive environment. As long as students are identified as special education, there's a likelihood that they're not going to have as much access to the least restrictive environment or their grade level instruction. Now, we always are trying to support that, but it's just more likely that that's the case.
So as we go through that needs assessment, we identify strengths and challenges, and you keep distilling it down. And you get to a certain point that once you've analyzed your strengths and challenges, they really push you to identify anywhere from 2 to 4 statements. And the strengths and challenges that we found really fit into 2 categories. So our first priority statement, KASD will expand and develop a systematic pre-K to 12 approach to proactively address gaps, giving all students access to standards and teachers the pedagogical skills to support struggling learners. The second priority statement, KASD will commit to the expansion and development of a data-informed systematic approach to addressing learning gaps in a restrictive environment. So for just at the risk of on a tangent that takes you far away. So our special ed population is higher than the state average. Special ed, the way a student gets identified in special education is their ability level is at one level and their achievement level is below it. And it has to be a significant enough, and it's called a deficit model. And so what happens is if you don't give interventions to a child early on, their level, we know what their level is, but their achievement continues to drop. And if you can give them supports, you can boost their achievement. And the way you reduce numbers is not by pushing students out of special education. It takes a number of years. The way you do it is you support students so that they don't fall so low that they get identified, which means we are giving support really everywhere that we need to give support for students to find success. It doesn't mean making it easier. Mr. Tim Chatton mentioned reading. You know, what are we doing with students who struggle in reading but have to sit in a chemistry class and read a chemistry textbook? What supports are, because are we assessing reading in that chemistry class? Because a student struggling to read a chemistry book we're supposed to be assessing chemistry. So what supports can we put in place? And so what you see in both of these is a system-wide approach, pre-K-12, and after do good things in places. Some places we're really good at stuff. Some places there's gaps. And so what we're committing to is trying to come up with, we will come up with a K-12 approach for how we're going to support students to try to keep that gap from getting so large that they get identified. So it's helping students to be useful as they go, not waiting for them to fall into a deficit so that they now need to be identified. So with this, we've set 5 goals around that concept of trying to set up a system K-12, pre-K to 12, and trying to give kids access to talk about least restrictive environment. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the least restrictive. So the least restrictive environment in a school is you're sitting in biology class, nobody's with you, you're just doing it by yourself. A little more restrictive would be you're in that biology class and you go to a special education class in another period, and the teacher in the special education class has the notes from biology and they're kind of helping you. So you're getting some additional support. A more restrictive environment, even than that, would be an aide is sitting with you in the class and to make sure that you're accessing curriculum. The most restrictive environment is you take the student out of the biology class, they sit in a special education class and they receive biology there. And the state has said, that is your last option. You need to try everything else first. And in order to do that, we need to develop the systematic approach where we are teaching teachers what are the things that we need to do to better support our students. So that's where these 5 goals come from. By June 2025, KASD will have developed and implemented a coordinated, data-driven pre-K to 12 system supports for all students. So this means pre-K to 12, it means no matter where they are in our school, we want to try to find the ways to support students in the least restrictive and to the extent that we can. By June 2025, goal 2, all teachers will consistently implement evidence-based instructional strategies to deliver rigorous evidence-based curriculum as evidenced in walkthroughs, formal observations, and evaluations. So we're gonna upscale what we do with these evidence-based strategies. And evidence-based strategies are strategies that are implemented that actually produce. So we don't, it's, you know, in the old way, we would say to a student, you need to come and you need to study harder. That's not evidence-based. Evidence-based would be putting something in front of the student, helping the student do something that actually produces a product that we can see improvement in the student. Goal number 3, by June 2025, all KASD teachers will demonstrate how to use screening data to identify the need for tier 1 interventions. Let me pause there. When we do this, there's 3 tiers of intervention. The first tier takes place in the classroom. So if it's to be a restrictive environment and I'm teaching a middle school history class, the teacher needs to understand what would be the tiers of intervention, what that I could do to intervene when a student is struggling in my class. And so what it really kind of looks like is a menu approach of things that our teachers will try to help our students find success in the least restrictive environment. Continue. The need for tier 1 interventions, demonstrate how to properly implement tier 1 interventions across the curriculum and measure the effectiveness of these interventions. So that's the 3rd goal. 4, by June 2025, all teachers and students will have access to a multi-tiered system of support. That's the 3 tiers. So tier 2 is a little more invasive, is not more direct. And then tier 3 is really kind of one-on-one, very intensive. This is a student who needs a lot of intervention. So all students will have access to that, and teachers will have access and understanding of how that works, so that when a student is struggling, they move through tier 1 to tier 2 and ultimately to tier 3. And this will be exhausted, the tiers will be exhausted before we ever put them through a special education evaluation process. So in other words, we will have exhausted everything we know to do before we start to look at the deficits. And so this is why it's data driven, because you're looking at data all the time to figure out whether students are moving. You're going to talk less about proficiency and more about growth, because growth is what we're looking for. The kid who's in the 99th percentile should be growing. The kid who's in the 9th percentile should be growing. Without growth, none of this can happen. Goal, by June of 2025, resources will be allocated to ensure all students operate within the least restrictive environment via data analysis, differentiated instruction, academic support, and co-teaching efforts. That one, if you ask me today, what does that look like in 2025? We don't know. What we do know is we might be using special education teachers differently than we use them today. So they might be a teaching environment where they are teaching by a regular ed teacher, because that's less restrictive than them teaching outside of the classroom, outside of the regular ed classroom on their own. So we've established these 5 goals, and then we also set an action plan.
Just 2 points of emphasis. It's a comprehensive planning model, but it's also it's very much a continuous improvement planning model where, many of the things we discuss, we do really well now. We just be better. And we look at ways that we can be better. It's we have multi-tier level of supports explicitly throughout the elementary schools, and we have them in secondary schools. They just look a little bit different, but being a little bit more strategic in that continuous process of evaluating to support. So we have to look through the eyes of a continuous model. So it's not completely, these aren't systems that don't exist. It's about making them better. And in addition, looking at some of the things that we discussed, Dr. Lever hit on it just at that very last point. We talk so much about how are we going to support kids to get where they need to be. And we look at it from most of those that are below the proficiency level, but how do we support kids that demonstrate proficiency before they even take the class? There are skill sets that students can demonstrate mastery before they even enter the class. Well, how do we support those students as well? So the conversation ends up focusing on those deficits are more, but what about where the strengths are? We view class assessment differently in areas where the mastery has already been demonstrated by a student. So I think these pieces are a bit redundant. You can kind of follow those action steps and see what do we need to do, establish and implement a district-wide assessment map. How you can't measure where you are without the proper assessment map. Develop those very detailed and consistent protocols for data analysis, conduct those meetings routinely, operationalize multi-tiered levels of support, implement, monitor, and adjust goals and instruction. And again, it's a cycle. It's a continuous improvement cycle to monitor growth and develop each student from where they are. Another piece I think it's somewhat redundant. What do we need to do in professional development? We'll support each one of those action steps. Assessment map development, understanding data protocols, solidifying tier 1 strategies, data team meetings and action planning, data-driven instruction, solidify tier 2 and tier 3 strategies so that they serve as a malleable menu of supports for students as indicated by their assessments. Is next, as far as timeline, we shared that this has been a lengthy process for obvious reasons. Today is October 15th, board review of the plan. We're open for questions. It has been available publicly since Friday, when copies were placed in various community locations and borough offices, schools, in each of the communities. The board, we would need to get a board approval in November. The 15th is the target date there, and then there's a submission to the Pennsylvania Department of Education. So they are our next step timelines. Questions?
I know I've heard for years now the question of why Kutztown's percentage of kids with special education is higher than our peer group. I think people just sort of scratch their heads and kind of never really understood about why that is. Have you seen this sort of program, systemic or systematic approach, been implemented in other districts that have experienced similar high levels of special education students?
Where I've seen it the most effective, the schools that I've been in where it's been the most effective is when we did not have levels of support. So we didn't have the most restrictive levels to implement things in tier 1 and 2 because we knew we couldn't get kids to this place. There are factors that drive their numbers down. Again, it's not about numbers. It's about, I mean, if we did this and we put in all of those things and our number remained at 21, we would be back here focused on growth and saying, look, you know, here's where our kids are growing. It's not really about the number. And I'm not sure in 3 years, we're going to realize enough to see the number drop to 17 or 18. What we should see is as students are coming through, we really ought to see fewer kids getting referred and fewer kids finding themselves being identified. This is a 3-year plan because that's what the state requires. But practically speaking, this is something the district, we should get so good at it that we're doing it for 9 or 10 years. And then I think in time we could see some real gains for students, but it won't be a short-term fix.
Understood.
I'm curious, the English language learners, students with disabilities, and students considered economically disadvantaged. I would imagine that a large number of kids fit all 3 groups.
Some do, for sure. You know, you're going to have a greater crossover between the economically disadvantaged and special education because they're larger pools. You know, if there's just it's a larger group of students, so you have a greater crossover.
In line with that, a number I'm really interested if we could pull out of the number of kids whose attendance is problematic, and whether that group is the group that's the numbers come down in that group.
Right.
Just a number I'd be very curious about. I don't expect you to have it, but just one that would be
There's a tough
useful.
reality in there, right? Like we're talking about achievement, we're talking about graduation, and we're talking about systems in place to help support students. Guess what? If they don't show up, none of it matters. Like it's, you know, that's just the reality. So attendance is a key factor, and we start looking at students not attend. You know, there's illness issues, but is it because they don't feel a sense of success in school? You know, it becomes a compounding problem sometimes. Is there at times a misunderstanding, lack of concern about the process of attendance? So I think attendance is a key factor because you can do anything, and unless they attend,
Can't teach kids who aren't here.
right?
But
Yeah.
on the other hand, that would give us an avenue to attack. It's a different sort of intervention than the tier 1, 2, and 3s, which are academic. This would be a different sort of thing, but obviously a very necessary one.
Yeah, if you were to ask one of our, and particularly an elementary principal, they can tell you just how much impact one student can have on state scores. Because when you're small, that, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 students really make a big difference. And again, it's not about the numbers. It's about putting something in place systematically that is going to continue to help kids, and it's going to continue to help our professionals grow in their understanding of what's the best thing that we could do. You see, it's not only the kids that are at risk that benefit from this. When you start looking at data and a teacher sees that their top kids are not moving, that has an impact on the teacher. And so our goal, the multi-tiered system ultimately helps all of our students. It targets groups that have kind of prompted us to do it. But if we do it well, and if we're deliberate about it, it ultimately impacts all of our students.
I'd like to understand just how drastically different is this from what we're doing today?
So how drastic, the question is how drastic is it than what we're doing today? We have not said that this is the focus of what we do in PD. So basically for the next 3 years, we're saying, this is what we're doing. Some of these things really well in pockets. That's why it's not as high a mountain as it might sound, because you can go into our elementary school, you can find they have really good tier 1 interventions everywhere across the elementary. What we need to do is we need to push that in secondary, because secondary is tradition. This isn't a Kutztown problem. This is a U.S. education problem. It's just not something well for the reasons Mr. Tim Chatton mentioned. We're from GPA, where it's like, well, you know what? They got a C in algebra. That's fine. Move them on. but a C in algebra usually means a C in algebra 2. It usually means something less than that after algebra 2. And so when we start to shift our attention to mastery and making sure that kids are getting things, that we're filling gaps, that has an add-on effect, as kids travel through our curriculum. So what we want to do is take what we do really well in some of our levels and make it in all of our levels. And then there's some other things like tier 2 interventions. We do well in some places, but we need to do well everywhere. So it's not entirely different. I would say that the change is we are say this is what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it, and we think it's going to benefit the kids who are in these subgroups, but we also think it's going to benefit all of our students.
Can I ask a question?
Pardon me?
Is there a brief explanation of tier 1 and tier 2
Sure.
interventions?
Tier 1, it can be as simple. So what's a classic one is there are students who have the new phrase is executive functioning. So if they have trouble with executive functioning, some of you up here are really good and really organized. Some of you are, that's not your gift. And you have a student who is a mess. Additionally, that becomes a barrier to their success. And honestly, the sad thing in education, what we've done is we've said, well, they're not organized. That's why they're not doing well. The difference is, so you can get this subtle shift. We're not assessing when they're taking a biology class. We're not assessing their ability to be organized. We're assessing their ability in biology. We're not assessing your ability to stay organized in math class. We need to know what you can do in math. So in a tier 1 strategy would be to help a kid with organization. What structures need to be in a kid who's getting a C, there's a cumulative effect. And so we want to have strategies that we can employ all across all of our classrooms to help students so they're not continuing. So there's a list of those tier 1. I can probably send you, maybe I'll send you in the next week in Cougar Tracks. I'll link a document entry that is our tier 1 interventions from the elementary school. So I can show you, and you'll have a sense of what that is. Tier 2 is typically if Mr. Tim Chatton is the teacher and maybe I'm an aide, I might help a student with something. Student might need to action of taking a test in a regular setting might just be a little too much for them. I had this problem in college. I had to learn, I had to go to the back of the room, had to be from everybody, and I did really well. But if I didn't do that, I just didn't do as well. It had to do with my ability to focus, my ability, and so tier 2 strategies are kind of that next level of what do we need to do to help a student find success, because we're going to teach them just to be organized. We're trying to teach them to be organized so that we can know how much math they know, how much science they know, how much physics. So that's the difference.
Question?
Dr. Ritter, yes.
Yes, Dr. Ritter.
Familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of need. You kind of, I think Dr. Lever sort of answered my question. Do these strategies take into account the fact that we have students who struggle with the certainty of, or the uncertainty of food insecurity, a more unstable home environment, maybe even whether or not they are certain there's going to be a home and not become homeless? So those are the things that get kind of looked at somewhere in this tier system?
Yes. And, over the years, we know that we love different acronyms in education. And over the years, there was response to intervention. And we've transitioned more to what we consider a multi-tiered system of support, which adds a few words. But really what that's about is looking at other factors that are not academic or maybe even not just, like Dr. Lever describes executive functioning, which isn't exactly an academic skill, but an organizational routine, let's say. So the multi-tiered would account for some of the supports in place to help students. It is addressing food issues, or there is the need for supports and referrals and allowing people to have access to the resources that are in the community.
And that's kind of the role, especially in our middle school, which we brought in, of communities in schools, right? To help students address some of those sort of what we would consider maybe exterior issues that aren't necessarily within the educational system of the district, but are happening out there in home and in the environment out beyond the school.
Yes. Yes, that's correct.
Okay. I think it's just important for us to connect the dots sometimes about these programs we put in place to really help boost the students' performance in our district.
Mr. Hess, we had a question.
Yeah. Something, Dr. Lieber, that you had said kind of got me thinking, and if it's too specific for this meeting, that's fine. But when I think about like a typical special education setup where a student would be pulled out of class in special ed to get some education there, you had said something about co-teaching, and I was just curious. I think I might have read about it, but just kind of curious, since it doesn't sound like it's something we're doing, kind of what that.
We do co-teaching. It's very staff intensive. And so you have to find a way to do it with the staff that you have. So if currently, and I'll, I'm not always concise, Mr. Hess, so I apologize. If currently we're having to support kids in a special ed room because of executive functioning issues, and because of they need extra help in work completion, because we're not doing that in the classroom. The idea is we build the supports so that they take place in the classroom, which frees up a special education teacher or a paraeducator to have a different role in a classroom. And so in an ideal setting, the best setting that I've worked in, we had three tiers of classroom instruction. We had for a special education student, a student who's not receiving intensive services is what we would call an itinerant student. So they're in regular classes and they check in with a special ed teacher routinely, but they're really not needing more interventions than that. The second level, so a student who's just in a regular ed class and is checking in, that would be the first level. The second level would be a co-taught class. So it's in a class and there's a special education teacher there, and let's say it's algebra. And so there's a special education teacher that co-teaches with the algebra teacher. And that special education teacher is getting the exact same instruction and is able to model that same instruction for the students and is able to help students right there in the classroom. So that would be a little more restrictive. The most restrictive would be that teacher who was co-teaching is also teaching a special education class to a very small subset of special education students that need even more intervention. But they're teaching one of the downfalls of special education, and I'm not speaking specifically of Kutztown, this is just a downfall of special education. Leave the regular ed classroom, they're not always getting the regular curriculum. They're getting other curriculum that is good, but it's not necessarily the same. It's not the same grade level standards. And so in an ideal world, we would set up a system that would allow us, and that's the allocation of resources that comes really kind of in year 3, that we get to a point of maturity where we're able to strategically put people where we need them the most to help and support kids.
Yeah, and just some other logistical change. More teaching now, conversely to the tiered supports, we have more co-teaching on the secondary level than we do on the elementary level. One of the simple reasons for that is just the way schedules align up and allowing those supports. In a perfect world, if your best co-teaching situations, you also have co-planning. Well, that's a lot of things to align for a schedule to work that way, that you can have co-planning as well. It's just, so you end up having these like partial versions of co-teaching or partial versions of these because it becomes a staffing reality at times to support students. And in a perfect world, when you have students with deficits, they would get grade level instruction plus supports, so they're in, but then that becomes a scheduling nightmare for the students sometimes. Like, how are they what are they missing then, right? Because if they're in their regular unit of study lesson and then they go out for support some other time, well, what are they missing? And then you start sometimes worried about that cost benefit of taking away things that kids enjoy about school just for the enjoyment of it, versus enjoying the love of learning. So it becomes really challenging. That's all. But
so this may be diving into some details that can be reserved for another day, but I know I've heard some discussion at secondary levels about the total instructional time in the classes and what the schedule currently looks like. So is that one factor that's certainly going to be evaluated so that students have more time in the classroom with their, rather than having 12 periods or 11 period K, like that the amount of time they have with the teachers.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that was 3 years ago. That was a focus of the secondary programming and scheduling committee, was to try to increase instructional time for all students within their subjects. We did increase it last year, take that out, but that's where we went from having to do that. You got to lose something in terms of time or day. And what we did is we went from connections every day to every other day, and we extended the periods on those every other days. So that just becomes, as soon as we start pulling those connections out, then everybody gets upset about where do we do the.
Connections is where tier 2 interventions take place. So not everybody needs tier 2 interventions, but connections would be a place where those would take place. And so everything is, there's always a trade-off.
No, and I've heard both, right? So
Yeah.
kids want to connect the connections every day because
Yeah.
that's an important time for them to connect with
Correct.
teachers when they have issues. But yet they would also like to have longer class periods in order to
Yeah.
have that instructional time.
So I think they're advocating for another hour of school. Can you say that, Cooper? Cooper, you want to just wrap the gavel and say
I
that?
think you can come to that conclusion, but I don't think that's likely.
Wouldn't be very popular, right?
No, but I mean, I know it's balanced, right? But
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, that's what I'm hearing on this side, is kids want
Yeah.
the connections to have time, but then they also feel like the classes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it is the dilemma that we have, because if we come back and to talk about connections, it will invariably be tied to our tier. And so, yeah, that's part of what we'll be studying and looking for data to support what it is we should be doing.
I have a quick question. Academic support is you at the high school where, you have it's like an intensive study hall basically, where
Yes.
you have some free time to work on things, but you're with I guess what you call like a regular teacher that.
Usually typically it's a teacher chosen by their subject area certification, but that they're your teacher, correct?
Right. So I was wondering, is that an example of co-teaching, or is co-teaching something different than that?
Co-teaching is two people from at the same
Same
time.
time? Okay.
Yes.
So would you put academic support under tier 1 or tier 2?
That would be to support.
Tier 2.
Yep.
Okay.
Tier 1 should all be able to occur within the classroom setting.
With, in a normal class
Yep,
period.
in that regular classroom
Okay,
setting.
that makes sense.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
I guess I should add this, is that there is a for review and comment, and that is, where can that be found?
On the website, the school website, and the school. So first of all, there's an announcement, we have the news feed at the bottom on the homepage. And the first item on is comprehensive plan. You click on that news feed, it takes you to a board web page, which is plan, which has this presentation. It has the comprehensive plan that I have and that was sent out to the community. And then it has a link to a feedback form. So from the community is welcome to give us comments and on anything that they see, anything that we think we should consider. It's been a very, very long, rigorous involving a lot of people. Yeah, but it's active today.
So just as a note, it might be also beneficial. I don't know if we can crop your presentation from YouTube. This is a lot of detail. And
Yeah.
for people that may not sit in the education world, it may be a lot to absorb. So kind of incorporating, not just having the information and a form for comments, but actually having some context around it and being able to provide.
I did not put that one up. That was for the team. This one had time chatting. He's a little more eloquent than me, so I suggest that we task Dr. Myers with paring this one down and giving us a copy of this on our website. Thank
Just
you.
to make it accessible, because I mean,
Yeah.
I think part of what's critical to all of this is get engaged,
Mhm.
right? And they have to understand what it is that
Yeah.
we're talking about. And
It's actually a part of the plan is that we need everybody to understand the tiers of intervention and why they're important. Mhm.
I have another quick question. I've noticed at the high school level, at least secondary level, that there's a lack of motivation in completing homework and in showing up to supports that people have available
Yeah.
to students is something that some students lack in when they get to the secondary level. What are there's different, do you see like different ways for this plan to help with that, particularly with getting them to want to do this, or is it a strong on them into the tier 1 and tier 2 so that we can improve their performance?
I think a student who's lacking motivation, a reluctant learner, I like to call them, would find some benefit in tier 1 intervention. They might also find themselves in 2 intervention because they're not doing well. So, ideally, you want students to want to do it for the right reason, which is because it's good for them. At the end of the day, we will coerce to an extent. But this is the greatest challenge in education is getting students to understand that they're the ones who benefit from it most. That is, there's a healthy population in any school who understand that. And Cooper, I have yet to be in a school where I did not find that in high school students. I might have even been guilty of that for a time myself when I was younger. But yeah, everybody has access to these interventions.
Yeah, one of the reasons I asked that is because with the issue, it is a good opportunity for students to get to support, like you said, which when we come up to like scheduling and stuff, that would be something that they would talk about. But there's also an aspect of it where only the students that want to take advantage of that are going to, because Connections is a mandatory, a time for mandatory help. It's more of a time to go and get help of the student's own volition. So that's something that having a Connections period, you might need to look into that, because right now, at least, a lot of the responsibilities on the students during Connections for getting help. So
Sure.
that's why I asked that.
No, you're absolutely right. And that is, it's less of a problem in middle school. It's not a problem in elementary school. But certainly as students get older in high school, it's a more pronounced problem because students make choices. And what we want is we want them to make the right choices. They're going to result in the best possible outcome for them. So as a science teacher who came into my office one day to tell me he's retired, he said, I'm retired and I'm a salesman for 35 years. Every day I've been trying to sell science, that kids need to learn science. And in part, that's what our teachers do. They kind of sell kids on, look, this is for you. This is going to be better for you. I don't know that our comprehensive plan involved that, but it will certainly it will institutionalize some additional support students will be able to access.
There's some fairly like psychology behind people who not seek out help involving motivation to avoid failure rather than to reach success. It's something that needs to, it's not a simple solution, is all I'm trying to point, but there are some fairly complex things going on, and those need
That's the social,
coercion
yeah.
Sometimes works.
Yeah, that's the social emotional learning side of what's happening. I have seen students that absolutely were self-sabotaging. They didn't feel like they could be successful. And the only way that they could save face, if you will, is to just not care. Because then the reason they were not successful was they felt it was because they couldn't do it. But the reality is quit and don't do stuff, then that becomes the reason I'm not successful, not because I'm dumb. And kids make that choice. It's the reason a multi-tiered level of support is good, because we don't want kids to get to that place where they don't believe they can do something. And that's building that mindset. And Dr. Darren, you're exactly right. There's some deep psychology that goes into why a student chooses to not do things. And it's not ever as simple as they just don't want to do it. There's usually a lot going on there that is behind why they're not doing it. And there's a whole side of this. Tim Chatton has been quite passionate about in building resilience in kids and getting them to understand the growth mindset that Carol Dweck has so eloquently talked about, and making sure that they are able to succeed in the environment they're in.